For our audience and for the sake of myself, because I still have such a hard time wrapping my head around the ontological argument, can you explain it like I'm 5 years old, what that argument means?
So, the most important thing to know about ontological arguments is there are many different kinds of them, right? And so I can explain an ontological argument to you, but if you want to have them all explained in detail, we'll be here until tomorrow. So, let's perhaps the simplest argument is one that perhaps is in Anselm, but probably didn't really get developed until Charles Hartshorne um, was writing some stuff in about the 1950s. So this is the modal ontological argument, a particular kind of modal ontological argument, because there are many different arguments of this kind. So Hartshorne, the kind of core of Hartshorne's argument is this. Here's a principle about God that many theists find plausible. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists, right? So it's it has to be that God exists, and it has to be that if there's a God, then it has to be that God exists. Okay, so that's the kind of starting principle. Uh, because this is formulated in terms of necessity, that when we've got our argument, we're going to need modal logic to assess it. Here's how the argument goes. Possibly God exists. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. Therefore, and now you can choose what you want the conclusion to be. God exists. Necessarily, God exists. Right? Either of those will do as a conclusion. Um, how do you get from the two premises to the conclusion? Well, if your background logic is a strong enough modal logic, it's just guaranteed that the conclusion follows from the premises. Right? I'm not sure that I want to try to go into the details of that now, but if we configure the whole thing in terms of possible worlds, so think of something claims necessarily true if it's true in all possible worlds, then, and a claim's possibly true if it's true in at least one possible world. Go back to the premise. The first premise was possibly God exists, so there's seven possible worlds where God exists. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. If there's even one world in which God exists, then God exists in all of them. Right, that's what that means. But where the first premise was God exists in at least one world, and the second premise is if God exists in at least one world, exists in all of them. Conclusion, God exists in all worlds, and hence in particular exists in our world. So that's why both necessarily God exists and God exists follow. Right? So that's it's easier to see the argument when you say it in terms of possible worlds, right? Because it's very easy to see that if God exists in at least one world, and if God exists in one world, he exists in all worlds. From those two claims, it follows that God exists in all worlds. So it's easy to see that the argument is valid. And also, it's sort of plausible that that second claim, if necessarily if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists, is kind of stipulative. You can just take that to be kind of definition of God. It's not one that all theists will accept, but many do. There are lots of necessary being theists, people who think that if there's a God, it's necessary that God exists and that that's a necessary truth. So that means all the interest in this argument is in the first claim, right? That it's possible that God exists or God exists in at least one possible world. And the difficulty for the argument is that kind of everybody knows that if you don't believe in the necessary God, you think that that God's impossible, doesn't exist in any worlds, right? So the argument, people are just going to divide on that first premise. People who already believe in the necessary God are going to accept the premise. Those who disbelieve are going to reject it. And the people who are agnostic is just going to be agnostic about it. Right? So the argument's kind of not going to do any useful work. You can't use it to persuade people. You can't be persuaded out of agnosticism or atheism by this argument. because the first premise is one that either you reject or you're agnostic about. The other thing is about this argument, if you're, suppose you replace the premise with the claim that it's possible that God doesn't exist. Right? So there's at least one world in which God doesn't exist. The second premise was if God exists in at least one world, he exists in all of them. But if he doesn't exist in one world, then he clearly doesn't exist in all of them. So he doesn't exist in any. So the conclusion now from possibly God doesn't exist and that central claim is that God doesn't exist, and in fact it's necessary that God doesn't exist. So the atheist has an argument that they can give back to the theist that's just as strong as the argument that the theist gave to them. Right? So that's another reason for thinking that this modal ontological argument isn't a good argument.
Wow.